Okay, so now let's take a look at some specific species that we get here in Western Kentucky. Excuse me, and these are some of the examples of the specimens that we're going to have to know on our lab quizzes. So we can break these native minnows down into 5 groups: the dace, the chubs, the minnows, the shiners, and the stone rollers. These are sort of broad groups that you can kind of partition Cyprinidae into. We also have the one non-native group here in Kentucky, the carps, and we're going to save them for a whole other lecture because they're a whole other thing. So we're going to try to learn at least one fish from each of these 5 groups. Actually, we've got, for most of these, we've got at least a couple, 3 that we're going to learn. Again, there are lots of these minnows in Kentucky. We don't have specimens of all of them in our collection, and it's unrealistic to learn how to identify all the minnows in Kentucky. But I'm going to try and get you to learn how to identify the common ones that we're going to run into here in Western Kentucky. Most of our work and our practice at identifying minnows will come as we work up those sample fish that we took in lab. So we took a lot of fish. Most of those fish were minnows. We're going to have to separate them out and count them and identify them. And so we're going to get a ton of practice working with the key and these minnows. Let's start with the dace. Some common ones we're going to run into here in Western Kentucky is the Western black-nosed dace. It used to be called just the black-nosed dace. Now they call it the Western black-nosed dace. The rosy-side dace, we get those mostly in Panther Creek and LBL. They're gorgeous. The southern red-belly dace are probably one of the prettiest native fishes, that, in my opinion. I don't know if we've ever run into any around here. I know they're here in Western Kentucky, but they are absolutely gorgeous fish. And so most of these are pretty easy to identify. The black-nosed dace, most of the dace have smallish scales, and this one does too. It's got a black stripe on the head. It's got black speckles. There are a few other things to look for in this black-nosed dace. The rosy-side dace, as the name suggests, it has rosy sides. It's got, I can't think of another minnow around here that has that real bright rose pink color on the sides. It's more pronounced in the springtime, but even in the fall you can really see it. Another diagnostic characteristic of this fish is it's got a really big mouth compared to a lot of the other minnows. As I said, the southern red-bellied dace is just gorgeous. It has very, very small scales. The breeding males have this incredibly bright red belly, as the name suggests. Also, when you see them, it's like their backs look like frog skin. It's like this beautiful dark olive with black speckles. They're an amazing fish. The easy way to identify this fish is it's the only fish, and certainly the only minnow, that has 2 stripes going down the side. So in a fresh specimen or a preserved specimen, if you see 2 stripes, it's got to be a red-bellied dace. And this is just another picture showing you kind of the 2 stripes and the red belly. Here again, this is a fish that's been preserved a little bit, but you can see the 2 stripes there. Got the very tiny scales. So those were dace. We also have some chubs around here. I'm not sure what we have in the collection, so I don't have. I only have one chub to talk to you about here, which is the creek chub. There are some other chubs around here, and we'll probably add some to this presentation at some point. But right now, all I'm going to talk to you about the creek chub. But that's okay because creek chubs are crazy common. You're going to run into creek chubs everywhere, so you need to learn how to recognize them. Now the chubs in general can be identified because they have a little barbel at the corner of the mouth, and no other minnows have this. And for most of the chubs, the way you find this barbel, it's not obvious. It's not like a catfish or a sturgeon or something where you just see the barbel. What you have to do is you have to grab them on the lower lip and pull their mouth open. And when you pull their mouth open, this little barbel right here in the corner of their mouth sticks straight out and goes ding, like that. And so just by opening that mouth and then looking, and you can usually see it with the naked eye, microscope always helps. However, in the chub that I'm going to talk to you about, the creek chub, it's not like that. It's a little bit, it's a small kind of flap, and I'll show you a picture of that. So here you can see I'm grabbing the chub with some forceps, forcing its mouth open, and there you can see that little barbel that is kind of tucked in there when their mouth is closed. When you open their mouth, it tends to stick straight out. So the creek chub is very common. It's a very tolerant fish, and so if you're getting nothing but creek chubs, you probably have poor water quality, but you find them everywhere. They can get larger. A lot of times when you're fly fishing, you can catch these things. They're not the best for an aquarium because they're aggressive and they'll eat a lot of the other fish. They have very small scales. That's pretty obvious when you look at them up close. If you're looking for that barbel in their mouth, it's not like the others. When you open their mouth, it doesn't stick out. It's actually a little flap in the groove above the upper lip, which you can see if you know where to look for it. And I'll show you here in a second. They have what I call a mustache, in that their upper lip gets wider in the middle, and I just call it a mustache just so I can remember that. A few other fish have this characteristic. And so here you can see the smallish scales. Oops, excuse me, I went too fast. Here is that little flap-like barbel. So this is looking under a scope, and you can see how it's not quite at the corner, it's more in the groove above the upper lip, but it's very noticeable when you know to look for it. Here we're looking at the fish head on, and you can see how the upper lip gets wider in the middle. That's the mustache. And here's some pictures. Now, some of these slides I got from a former student of mine, Josh Sherwood, so I must make sure and say thank you to him because I'm borrowing some of his slides. And here he's kind of showing you the same thing, a big mouth. Also, another characteristic is the spot on the anterior, on the origin of the dorsal fin, and you can see that there in the lower right hand picture. And again, if you look up close, you can see that mustache. Okay, so we call this family the minnow family, and then one of the groups that we talk about are the minnows. They just have minnow in their name, or it's just a way, it's a subgroup of the minnow family. And some common ones we're going to run into around here are the suckermouth minnow, the blunt-nosed minnow, the fathead minnow, and the Mississippi silvery minnow. These are fairly common ones around here. Okay, so one of the minnows that we run into a lot here in western Kentucky is the suckermouth minnow, and Phoenicobus mirabilis, which means deceptive life. And that's probably because it was first thought to be in the sucker family because of the sucker mouth, but then they figured out that it was actually a minnow with a sucker mouth. And again, remember, the suckers and the minnows are very similar. Obviously, the mouth is a distinguishing characteristic for this fish. And the thing is that this mouth looks different than the mouth in a lot of suckers. It's just what I would say C-shaped versus D-shaped, and that doesn't really hold up super well. But here's what I'm talking about. If you look at the suckermouth minnow, it's like a C shape. It's got those two big lobes that come down off the sides. Whereas a lot of the suckers, the red horses and that, it's more of a D shape. You can see their bottom lip is kind of straight across. But most importantly, they don't have those two big lobes that just kind of really curl down. So once you see this, it's pretty easy to identify. And it has a spot on its caudal fin that is pretty obvious. And so when you're making your piles and you're sorting minnows into different piles, and you'll have a pile with a bunch of fish with a spot on its tail, it's a good idea to think that maybe this is a suckermouth minnow. And again, you can see the fleshy lobes at the corner of its mouth. It looks like a chub, but it doesn't have barbels like a chub. Within this group of the minnows, there's a genus called Pimephales that's pretty unique. These are the only minnows that guard their nest. They tend to stick their eggs on the underside of rocks or vegetation. Sometimes like for example, one time I raised some minnows in an aquaculture pond, and what you do is you throw a bunch of styrofoam out there, and the eggs will get stuck in the bottom of the styrofoam, and then the males will hang underneath there and guard it. They're very common, and they're easily identified. They have this unique back. And their back, on the back of their head in front of the dorsal fin, it's very flat, and it's got very small, crowded, roundish scales, almost like a cobblestone street. And once you've seen this, it's easy to recognize. The scales on that flat back part look different than the ones on the side. These are a very common bait store minnow. Fathead minnows are commonly the minnows that you would buy in a bait store, and consequently they get dumped out a lot. So people really shouldn't dump their bait buckets out, but they do. But also a lot of times if you're fishing with minnows, they just escape, and so these have gotten spread to almost every water body in the state in that way. Here's comparing a couple of genera of minnow, and you can see how the back of the Pimephales looks a little bit different. It's broad, and it's got small scales. You see the fish up top, the scales are all the same shape and the same size, and the back in front of the dorsal fin, it kind of comes to a ridge, whereas in that Pimephales, it's a flat roof. So I guess it's a ridged roof versus a flat roof. And you can see how those scales are crowded, and they're more round, and they're just a different shape than the ones on the side. Whereas in the Tropus, the fish on top, the scales are kind of the same shape all the way around. So within the genus Pimephales, we've got a few. We've got the blunt-nosed minnow, the fathead minnow. There's also a bullhead minnow, but we're just going to look at the blunt nose and the fathead because those two are really common. The blunt nose has an overhanging snout and a spot on its tail. And so that's one way to identify the blunt nose from the fathead minnow, but another way that's very reliable is to look at the mouth. In the fathead minnow, if you look from the side, that mouth is at almost a 45-degree angle, whereas in the blunt nose minnow, the mouth is horizontal. And again here, they're kind of showing you the same thing. They're showing you the fathead, the mouth is at an angle, whereas the blunt nose, the mouth is horizontal. And I mentioned that they have the very obvious spot at the caudal fin. The males sometimes can be mistaken because the males get really stocky and get these big tubercles. And so sometimes the males of the blunt nose minnow are mistaken for fathead minnows because the fathead is a stockier minnow. But you got to look at that mouth. The mouth will still be horizontal. Even though the male is big and stocky, his mouth is horizontal. That's a blunt nose minnow. And so here again is showing the male versus the female, and you can see how the male, the head is very squared off when he's in breeding condition, and of course you can see the tubercles there. But again, if you look at that mouth is horizontal. Now I like to point out fish that kind of look similar so that you can look at certain characteristics to tell these similar fish apart. If you got a pile of fish, a lot of times you're going to confuse the blunt nose minnow with the suckermouth minnow because of that spot on the tail. That spot is very similar on the two. But of course, the suckermouth minnow does not have that flat part on the back of the head, and it's got the sucker mouth. And so even though you look at the spot and you might put these fish in the same pile, when you start to look at them closely and you look at the mouth, you can easily tell the sucker mouth from the blunt nose. Now here again is the fathead, which is a stockier minnow. And I don't think it's quite as common around here in Western Kentucky as the blunt nose, but you are going to run into these. Again, a lot of times because of bait bucket transfer. Another minnow that's very common is the Mississippi silvery minnow. It's pretty obvious where this name comes from. They have a very silver coloration, very shiny and flashy. This genus, one of the diagnostic characteristics for this genus is that there's a groove, the lacrimal groove, which is a nose groove. Lacrimal means tear, so it's between the eye and the nose. And if this groove extends well up onto the nose, that's diagnostic for this genus. And what I'm trying to show you here is that groove, and here I've kind of outlined it to show you what we're looking at. So that's one thing to look at, but I think that's not, I think there are other characteristics that distinguish this genus. I think at that part of the key, if you look at the intestines, whether the inside of the peritoneum is black or whether it's silvery, is also another thing that's easy to make. This is a fairly easy genus to identify. Now, once you know you have a Hypognathus, once you know you're in this genus, then there's about 5 species, and to identify them, you need to look at what's known as the basioccipital process, which is a bone in the back of the skull. And so you basically have to cut the isthmus of the fish and bend the head back and kind of break the skull off from the vertebrae. And that basioccipital process should be sitting right there, and it's the shape of the back of that bone that helps you identify which species you have. And here's a picture from your key, and you can see the kind of different shapes, and you can see where this bone is. So if you look at this, you see we're looking from the ventral side of the fish. You can see the mouth there, and you're looking up toward the dorsal side of the fish, and you can see the different shapes. Our Mississippi silvery minnow will have a concave back to that basioccipital process. Here's a picture of one that I dissected. So again, you're looking at from the ventral surface. You can see that this is actually, this is kind of where the vertebrae attach to the skull. This is at the sort of the top and the back of the skull. But again, you can see that concave part to this process, and that's how you know that you've got a Mississippi silvery minnow. Okay, another group we run into a lot are the shiners. And some common ones that we'll see around here: golden shiner, the emerald shiner, the striped shiner. The golden shiner is another common bait store minnow, so you're going to see those a lot of times. The golden shiner, once you've seen them, they kind of jump out at you and you recognize them right away. They have this depressed lateral line, which you see here, and you see in this picture again. So the lateral line kind of dips down. They obviously have a very golden color, which is what kind of gives them away when you've got fresh specimens. Something that you don't see in the keys, but I think, is that they have what I call a very even shape. They're evenly tapered from the dorsal fin in both directions. It's like you could take this fish and fold it in half, and the halves would match up perfectly. Whereas a lot of fish don't do that. A lot of fish, their head seems to be a little bit lower than the tail. But if you look at this picture, you see what I'm talking about. Another characteristic that the key does have is it's got a little scaleless heel between the anus and the pelvic fins. And here's another picture of that here. And it's not super obvious in these pictures, but it's something that you can look for in these fish. But again, the golden color in the fresh specimens will give it away. And once you've seen these a few times, you'll recognize them pretty easily. The emerald shiner is, again, very common fish. You get these in a lot of samples. I think they're spreading, their ranges are expanding, so you're more likely to find them. One thing that's diagnostic for this is that the dorsal fin is set farther back than in most minnow species. The origin of the dorsal fin is well behind the origin of the pelvic fins, whereas in other fish, the origins line up more. And you can also look at the anal fin. You see a concave margin on the anal fin, but it's that dorsal fin set back that's often the diagnostic characteristic. Another shiner we run into in the genus Lexillus is the striped shiner. These can be a little bit larger, and one of the ways to identify this genus is the scales are tall and thin. So if you look at the scales in this picture here, you can see how, whereas scales a lot of times are more squarish, whereas the width is about the same as the height. In these, the width is much less than the height. That's one of the keys in the identification and in the dichotomous key. And here you see the males are a little bit stockier, which is usually true of most of the minnows, especially during the breeding season. The males get much stockier and much more colorful. But you can see those long, tall scales in this genus. Now the striped shiner, you identify by rolling it and looking at the back. And the stripes along the sides tend to come, and when you look in the fish from the top down, they make a V. And that's how you can identify the striped shiner versus other fish, like the maybe the common shiner. I can't remember exactly what all is there in the key, but those stripes make a V. That's a good character on this fish. Okay, the last group I want to talk about are the stone rollers. And these are really, really common, probably the most common fish that we're going to get in our samples. Now, I talked about this in class already, but it's not really clear to me right now which species we have here in Western Kentucky. The Fishes of Tennessee does not agree with Brooks Burr's distributional atlas of Kentucky fishes. And so I'm kind of working on summarizing these into a separate talk, into a separate PowerPoint. We've got two species here in the Midwest, the central stone roller and the large scale stone roller. And there's some pretty clear differences between them. The large scale seems to have kind of a disjunct distribution, but right now we're not going to, in this presentation, we're not going to say which one we have. I think it's the large scale stone roller, but like I said, Fishes of Tennessee kind of disagrees with me. We'll get that all straightened out. Now, they call them stone rollers because they probably roll stones along and use, build nests that way, or also because they have this scraper on their bottom jaw they use to scrape algae off and maybe kind of roll the stones that way. So either way is where they get the name from. Whenever you're standing on a bridge or somewhere and you're looking at fish and you see a big school of fish and you see a lot of flashing at the bottom, probably stone rollers. That's probably them getting in there and scraping off of those stones. They are herbivorous, so they have this long black intestine, and that's usually between that and the cartilaginous shelf on their bottom lip. They're pretty easy to identify. I say they feel soft when you pick them up. They've got small scales, but just their body in general seems to be softer. And I know you're not going to find that in the key, but that's just one of the things I use. So here you can kind of see the scraper. Again, you can see it in this picture. If you feel it with a probe, you feel how hard this thing is. A lot of times when you have preserved specimens, you can see that black peritoneum showing through the sides even before you cut it open. And so here again, in this picture, you can clearly see that black, and that's something that people use to identify preserved specimens. When you cut it open, this is what it looks like. Again, that coiled intestine with the dark black peritoneum. Now, sometimes you're going to want to mistake this fish for the suckermouth minnow because of that C-shaped mouth, but once you put them next to each other and you get used to it, it's pretty obvious which is which. The stone roller's got the scraper, and it doesn't have those big fleshy lobes on its lips like the suckermouth does. Okay, so those are just a handful of the minnows we have here in Western Kentucky, and some of the ones that we're going to pull out of the collection and we're going to learn by sight. So we'll do that in class. Let me know if you got any questions. In the next lecture, I will be talking about the non-native minnows in Kentucky. So I'll see you then. Thanks a lot.